Welcome, everybody, to this extra March session of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. We're meeting on a rather somber occasion, just after the Russian invasion and the ensuing war in Ukraine. We have dear friends who have both friends and family in Ukraine. It's consistent with the mission of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara to spread education and, more importantly, call to action. Look to see what is it that we individually or as a group can do that could make a difference in this situation. Our speaker today is Adrian Ivakhiv, professor from the University of Vermont, who also happens to be a visiting scholar at UC Santa Barbara. He has graciously agreed to develop a presentation for us today. Gives us the opportunity to learn more about what's going on, perhaps more with a different or a broader perspective than what we may be able to get from discrete sound bites that we hear on American news. Adrian is a professor of environmental and cultural studies at the University of Vermont, visiting scholar here at UCSB. He's conducted research in Ukraine since 1989, when, as a Canadian USSR scholar, he studied the impact of the Chernobyl nuclear accident on both cultural and environmental politics in Ukraine. So with that, Adrian, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Judy, for inviting me to speak here, and thank you all for taking time out of your Saturday afternoon if you're here on the West Coast, or whatever time of day it happens to be where you are. I study the cultural dimension of environmental issues, which means that I study the way people perceive, think of, make sense of, and communicate about environmental issues, environmental conflicts, conflicts over landscape, over particular places, and so on. And sometimes those conflicts involve nationality, a sense of national identity, sometimes religious identity, or other forms of cultural identity. And I've been doing this for years in different places, but one place that I come back to pretty regularly is Ukraine, and that's because, not just because I happened to study there as a graduate student for a year as a Canada USSR scholar at really the tail end of the Soviet Union, looking at how the Chernobyl accident had affected people's identity, people's willingness to bring about change, including environmental and social change, and also change that led to what became the national independence movement in Ukraine. The other reason why I've been connected to Ukraine is because I am Ukrainian-Canadian. I grew up in Toronto. My parents were both refugees from World War II. Toronto has a large Ukrainian community, so I grew up speaking Ukrainian, and I've been to Ukraine maybe a dozen times or so for shorter or longer periods. I have family, distant family there. I have friends, I have colleagues, and I've been trying to keep in touch with them, to follow along, to see what's happening on the ground with many of them over the last couple of weeks, and particularly since the invasion began. So what I'm going to do today is partly based in that research interest, which takes a lot from the work of other people, other experts on Ukraine, whose work I follow, whom I know and try to keep up to date with, and partly my own research as well as personal connections that I have. So what I'll do is I'll cover 5 topics in 5 slides. It might take me 15 or 20 minutes. I could probably talk forever about these things, but I'll try to keep it short so that we have time for questions, answers, discussion, and all of that. So what does Vladimir Putin want? What are Russians thinking? What are Ukrainians thinking? Why is all of this important for us, and what can we do? One of the big questions around all of this has been, what is this man who happens to have the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet at his fingertips? What is he thinking? It is larger than the US nuclear arsenal the US still has the largest military. Well, actually, I recently read that China's is larger. They're all large enough to do an awful lot of destruction. Up to this point, most analysts have been trying to understand Putin's logic as if he were a rational actor who's acting on the basis of interests, strategic goals, and the calculation of costs and benefits. And in the past, this has kind of worked. He's had a long history as a politician going back to 1999, long history that's included various power grabs, including wars and military incursions involving Chechnya, involving Georgia in 2008. Chechnya back right at the beginning, it kind of helped him rise up to the top of the Russian political establishment. Moldova, and then as we know, Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, and now the rest of Ukraine. Understanding his strategic thinking has been complicated, and in this case, I would argue does not work if we think of him as a rational actor. And there are two main reasons for that. One is that as an aging autocrat, he, like all people who've got a lot of power and who've figured out how to eliminate political challengers, he's surrounded himself by yes men, by people who kind of go along with his vision. And therefore, he's become increasingly insulated against the sort of reality checks and balances that would otherwise keep him tethered into a kind of international consensus reality. And not all analysts say this, but I think the signs are there that, and it's possible that the COVID pandemic has made him more insulated as well. There's speculation about that. The other reason is that Putin is deeply personally and emotionally invested in a kind of vision of the future of Russia that is based on a revisionist and neo-imperial understanding of Russia and Russia's greatness. And this has a huge implication for Ukraine. He's written about this. He wrote a 5,000-word essay published last summer. Other people close to him, Dmitry Medvedev and others, have written almost as a kind of alter ego of Putin's about this. There was a piece that was leaked that was published in some Russian online versions of newspapers last week that had assumed that the invasion was victorious, and they took it off when they realized their mistake. But it was a piece by, I forget his name, Opotov or somebody like that, basically articulating the same vision of a greater Russia that is reestablishing itself after the calamities of its recent history. So Putin considers the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union, to have been a catastrophe and one that Russia has not yet recovered from. He considers Ukrainians, at least in what he's been saying and writing, to be not a real nation and to be effectively no different than Russians, except a kind of little brother. The term little Russian, Maloros, is the term that was used in the Russian Empire to refer to Ukrainians. So seen as a kind of, part of the Slavic, East Slavic, Greater Russian family, but they have deviated. They've been misled by the West, by a kind of decadent and untrustworthy Western world. Europe, terms that sometimes actually get used in Russia are terms like gay-ropa, which refers to the Europe of LGBTQ rights, women's rights, and other threats to white Christian European civilization. So there's a real kind of, I would say, deeply conservative and anti-modern strain in Russian thinking among some of the people who've been influential on Putin in recent years, that comes out in this idea that Ukraine needs to be brought back. It's been severed from the homeland and infected by the virus of nationalism, he says, and needs to be purified. And if you remember his reasoning when he announced when he actually started this invasion. It needs to be denazified. And I'll come back to that shortly. So in other words, Putin's thinking doesn't really allow us to see him any longer as a kind of rational actor. It's more troubling than that. And that makes it more important for us to pay attention to what's happening in Ukraine right now. What are Russians thinking with all of this? Most Russians do not want war. Most Russians, certainly the majority, do not know that Russia is at war with Ukraine. And that's part of the problem. So I'll talk a little bit about the Russian media system. And just to simplify, we can divide that between state media, social media, and independent media. State media being controlled by the Russian state, funded by it, and so on. Independent media being, at this point, fairly small, various forms of independent media, but with varying degrees of accessibility to the broader public. Mostly they're online, and in the last week or so, they've been under a lot of pressure with independent media channels being closed down and forced out of the country and that sort of thing. I'm thinking of channels like Dozhd and Novaya Gazeta and others. And then social media is a kind of complicating factor. More than half of all Russian citizens check the internet at least once a day and use social media at least daily. Most popular websites are YouTube, Vkontakte, which is sort of like a Russian version of Facebook, but it's its own thing, and it's pretty restrictive in terms of political expression. WhatsApp, Instagram, some other Russian social media sites, as well as Facebook, TikTok, Telegram, and others. And I'll come back to them in a moment. As far as state media goes, which is still where most Russians get their information, it's become pretty tightly controlled, and particularly on this international issue, and controlled so as to be on message. And the message is that Russia is not at war. The words war, invasion, and attack aren't being allowed in the mass media in Russia. It's called a special military operation with the goal of demilitarizing Ukraine. To really understand this, we have to go back 8 years. So as you all know, 8 years ago, Ukrainians, by the hundreds of thousands or millions, mobilized in opposition to a president whose name was Yanukovych, Viktor Yanukovych. He had promised to make a trade deal with Europe, with the EU, and at the last moment he sort of backtracked and made a deal instead with Russia, with Putin. And people were kind of shocked by that, a lot of young people in particular. To understand Yanukovych is a complicated story, so I'll give you a little bit of Ukraine's recent history when I come to Ukraine. But the point is that in Russian media, this Maidan revolution, which overthrew this president who was considered a kind of a dictator, authoritarian, and illegitimate at that point, particularly after the shooting of dozens of people in the streets of Kiev. So Yanukovych fled the country. Russian media portrayed that as a neo-Nazi coup, and it's been continuing to portray it that way. It's been portraying Ukraine as a failed state run by, Putin last week called them drug addicts and Nazis, as a NATO puppet state. And this has been connected to that kind of demonization of the West, of Europe, and of the US that's been sort of ramping up over this entire period. Contrary evidence isn't really admissible to any of these claims, but just briefly, Ukraine is a multi-party democracy with a Jewish president, until recently a Jewish prime minister, the second country in the world with a Jewish president and prime minister at the same time, the first being Israel. I believe a Jewish defense minister. The far right movements that did play some role during the Maidan revolution have never had much public support as far as voting goes, something like 1.5%. Russian media depicted the first election as a far-right takeover, and they had programming all ready to go and in fact released it briefly because they had assumed that the leader of a small group called Right Sector, sort of an ultra-conservative group, would become, was it president or, yeah, president. He didn't, he had 1.5% of the vote. But somehow they thought that they would keep playing this up. And it's a complicated situation, but as a multi-party democracy, Ukraine's kind of been going back and forth between various political parties. Zelensky's victory was 73% voting in favor of him. His party is a brand new party that was kind of formed around him with many political neophytes who had not been in politics. So it's sort of a struggling democracy trying to figure out how to deal with a very, very difficult economic situation exacerbated by a war on its eastern border. Is it a failed state? Not if you compare it with a lot of other states. Politically, it's not failed. Economically, it's been struggling. Is it a NATO puppet state? That's an important point to consider because one of the arguments has always been that NATO expanded practically to the borders of Russia and that this has humiliated Russia, which raises the question, whose humiliation counts and whose doesn't in the world? But let's leave that aside. NATO did expand. It expanded because a lot of post-Soviet and East European countries wanted the protection that they saw NATO as offering. And right now we're seeing why, and we're seeing why it didn't expand quickly enough for Ukraine. But again, that's a long argument. There are different perspectives on it, and I'd be happy to take it up in the Q&A. So what are Russians thinking? And is this kind of state control of media succeeding? They've been clamping down on independent media, particularly in the last week or so. So it's really not getting out there to the majority of Russians, as far as I know. But there still is stuff on the internet. And I believe Facebook has been taken down in Russia. If anyone knows, you can correct me, but that's what was reported. Google, other things have been kind of slowed down. Twitter has been made more difficult and so on. There have been demonstrations of thousands of people in cities around the country with arrests, tens of thousands of people demonstrating, thousands of arrests. Supposedly, what's being considered is a state of martial law, but it hasn't been announced, and we'll see if it will be. But there are cracks in what we might consider the information curtain, and I want to come back to that in a few minutes. So it is possible to get some news, especially if people in Russia have contact with Westerners. But one of the main tropes in current state media coverage is that there's a lot of fake footage on the internet. Beware of it. Don't believe what you see on the internet because Western countries, NATO, and Ukrainians are trying to bombard us with fake news. Now that's a kind of story we've become familiar with in this country, and I'm going to come back to that connection too. Another media trope has been that it's shocking what they, presumably Ukrainians, are doing to us being the Russians in Eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region. They're Russians now because Russia offered them Russian citizenship. The whole question of Russian speakers and all of that is very complicated, but it should suffice to say that most Ukrainians are bilingual and speak Russian or understand Russian. And to speak of persecution of Russian speech or language doesn't really make much sense. What are Ukrainians thinking? Okay, a little bit of background. So Ukraine, as we know, is its own state, has been since 1991, independent of the Soviet Union. Before that, it was a republic within the USSR. Its history goes back a long way. It had statehood of its own back around 1917, 1918, off and on in the midst of the war, the revolution. The Soviet Red Army was sort of occupied with fighting all around Russia and parts of Ukraine. The White Army the Ukrainian National Republic, or the Ukrainian People's Republic, proclaimed independence, established itself for periods at a time between 1918 and 1921 or 22, with a capital in Kyiv. But that eventually kind of got closed off by the triumph of the Soviet army. And from 1922 on, Ukraine became the Ukrainian Soviet Republic within the USSR. Independence was voted on in a referendum in 1991, in which I believe 91% of Ukrainians voted in favor of it, and this was entirely across the country. The last 30 years have been difficult, economically very difficult, characterized by some of the same problems we've seen in Russia and some other post-Soviet countries, where there was a rapid selling off of nationalized industries to those who were best positioned at the time, who were sort of members of the kind of the young communist elite, who became what we now call oligarchs, became ultra-rich billionaires and own many important industries. Unlike what happened in Russia, where Putin kind of centralized control with an elite of oligarchs, in Ukraine it's never been quite that centralized. There have been oligarchs, sort of clans of oligarchs, acting as rivals to each other, which has allowed for some sort of pluralism, and to a certain extent they have funded political parties, media, and so on, but not exclusively. There's been plenty of other opportunities for getting news and for organizing political parties, as we've seen with the last few elections. So Ukraine has been a country that's also been veering a little bit to the west, but then going back to the east, kind of a back and forth. In 2004, the Orange Revolution protested the clearly falsified election of President Yanukovych, whose name I mentioned earlier. The Orange Revolution brought in the government of Viktor Yushchenko. Unfortunately, there was infighting and things didn't turn out as well as people wanted. And by 2010, Yanukovych, the same guy, got elected again, thanks to Western advisors led by Paul Manafort. Now, if you've been following Donald Trump, you know who Paul Manafort is. So that's where he comes from. Eventually, Yanukovych gets thrown off 10 years later in the Maidan Revolution. And now we have this state of war that's been defining the last 8 years. But also the last 8 years have seen a kind of strengthening of social capital around the country, a kind of efforts to build social resilience. In part, this has been supported by Western NGOs, and in part, it's just Ukrainians trying to figure out how to live. There have been some decentralization laws that have helped to give people a better sense of their own agency, their own political and social agency. And all of that is visible in the resistance to this invasion. So 10 days ago, shock and disbelief. Most Ukrainians, they've been hearing these predictions, but they didn't think that Russian armies would invade the entire country. They thought, okay, Putin might want to take a bigger chunk of eastern Ukraine or something like that, but why would he invade us? They couldn't possibly take over. And it looks like they may be right. So shock and disbelief, but it's turned for many Ukrainians into a kind of resoluteness, a sense of unity and resistance. Many have been fleeing for safety to the countryside, to Western Ukraine, across the border, as we've seen now over 1 million. Many have remained and are sheltering in different places. Many are active in resistance in various forms, nonviolent, or taking up weapons when needed. It's very surprising to a lot of people, including to me, that Kharkiv, Kyiv, the two largest cities, are still holding out. Only one major city has so far been essentially taken by the Russian military, that's Kherson in southern Ukraine. The bad part of that is that they can now start playing Russian state media on the TV, beaming it out in southern Ukraine, which has a tendency to kind of render more confusion and so on. But the real difference between what people expected and what I believe Putin expected, which was rapid victory, and what's actually happened, comes from the difference in commitment between Ukrainians defending their land, their homes, their lives, their sovereignty, their hard-gained sovereignty for many of them, against a Russian army that's been rushed into a war that many of them don't understand. They don't know why they're there. They didn't realize they would be invading this country, and so on. And they're ill-equipped because they weren't prepared for a long, drawn-out thing. So the information that the Putin government was working with seems to have been flawed. And that goes back to my comments about what Putin has been thinking. Various complications, social media, cyber war. Surprisingly, again, Ukrainians have been doing pretty well on the informational and cyber front, you might say. They've mobilized a lot of activists, including activists around the world. If you're familiar with Anonymous, the hacking network, hackers network, they seem to have joined against the Russian invasion. President Zelensky's video speeches have done a great job. The fact that he's there, that he's visible every day, even though Kyiv has been bombarded, gives people a sense that not only is this country working together, but the leadership is there to lead it. And there's a great sense of global solidarity. All right, what's at stake and why is it important for us? First of all, the war in Ukraine is not a two-way conflict. Ukrainians, citizens and residents of Ukraine, are victims of an unprovoked invasion. Russian efforts to blame Ukraine, NATO, the US, and the West, they may be based on certain histories that, again, are complicated, but they are at this point strategies of war intended to sideline the victims and place Russian neo-imperial interests at the center of world attention. Putin wants to meet with Biden, not with Zelensky. Zelensky is not important to him. In fact, there have been, according to Ukrainian authorities, 3 assassination attempts, all of them foiled locally in Kyiv. Assassination attempts on Zelensky's life. So Ukraine's very existence as an independent, sovereign, democratic, and more or less European state is a threat to Putin's autocratic, neo-imperial vision of Russian power. And that's why the end game is about absolutely taking control of Ukraine, taking it over, destroying opposition, or I don't know what the or is. It's very difficult to know what Putin would settle for. Now, there are things that I think Zelensky is prepared to talk about, like military neutrality, which would work if it was supported by the West and by other important players around the world. You may know that Ukrainians gave away their nuclear missiles and arms in 1993, 94, for the guarantee that their boundaries will not be violated. Russia signed on to that. The US and the UK signed on to it. It's called the Budapest Memorandum. Russia violated it in 2014 and not much happened. A few sanctions, selective sanctions, but nothing major. So why would Ukrainians trust that kind of agreement? I think that Zelensky is trying to involve Israel in negotiations and some mediation, and China potentially. And with those kinds of players, especially China on board and the West, maybe some kind of neutrality can be negotiated, but that's, at this point, that's still getting ahead of us. Second point is Russian neo-imperialism, as I think I've presented it, a threat to Europe? Is it a threat to us? Even if Russia's military is not the strongest in the world, its nuclear arsenal is the largest. And its informational and hybrid war techniques, as they're called, are well-honed and powerful. And their goals, as we've seen, include weakening the liberal democratic world, the world of sovereign democratic states that the US and West pretend at least to champion. And we've seen the results of that, of this hybrid and informational warfare in the domestic politics of our own country in the last 5-6 years. and many other countries, including meddling in the Brexit vote and various other sorts of things, and propping up far-right political parties all across Europe, in Hungary, in France, in Italy. So this vision of a kind of rearranged world is not separate from us, and it's not incidental to these other problems that we've been identifying in media, fake news, and things like that. I would argue that they're part of a global struggle over the fate of democracy, and that democracy is in fact at stake. It goes without saying that the US and other Western nations are not innocent historically in their relations with the rest of the world, and that oligarchs are not just in Ukraine or in Russia, they're everywhere, and their wealth corrupts politics everywhere. Democracy requires constant maintenance, vigilance, and action. And right now, Ukraine is probably the most urgent battleground in this struggle between democratic institutions and democracy as a kind of way of life, with all its challenges and difficulties, and oligarchy, authoritarianism, and the kind of militarism that we're seeing in Ukraine right now. Okay, so just to wrap up, what can we do? Call politicians, urge them to support sanctions more than there's been, and I would argue urge them to actually support a no-fly zone. I realize that that seems a non-starter to many people, but there are ways of having a no-fly zone without direct NATO involvement. And I'd be happy to share information about that. Call friends in Russia. If you have any connections through professional, organizational links, through family links, whatever, it's absolutely imperative that we be in touch with Russians on the ground. When state media is not allowing discussion of the reality of the war, the only way that people can find out is if they hear it from enough places. And Russian support and acquiescence is what allows their government to conduct this assault. Thirdly, reject Russian propaganda narratives. They're intended to obscure the truth. There's plenty of analysis on that. And really, I want to argue that media are absolutely important. We need to support our own media institutions to allow them to carry out the kind of work. I've been pretty impressed with even our major news networks, CNN and MSNBC and others, being on the ground in various parts of Ukraine. There's a lot more that can be done by our own media, but we need to support the best of our media and the best of media that can actually have an impact in that part of the world. And finally, you can donate to humanitarian as well as civil and or military aid organizations. And there's a few websites right there that I would recommend. And various articles, this links to a list of places. This Fast Company article is quite good. Kyiv Independent is an English language newspaper that's online now with excellent journalists, reporters covering what's happening. And there are some other English language sources as well online. I will leave it there and gladly take questions.
No, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, do we have any questions? John, you have your hand raised.
I remember reading recently that that when he gave his 1 hour emotional speech back a couple weeks ago, that the correct translation, maybe you can tell me this is correct, of what he said was that those who do not long for the former Soviet Union have no heart. Those who wish to, I'm paraphrasing here what I remember, those who wish to recreate it have no brain. Is that, that's what they said, the actual translation of what he said there, and which is meaning that, yeah, I kind of like it, but it'd be stupid to try and redo it. Do you have any information on whether that was a correct translation? Because everything was a translation. He was speaking in Russian.
Are you referring to Putin?
Putin, yes, when he made that 1 hour emotional speech about just before the invasion.
Yeah, I don't remember that line being in the speech, but it's possible that some version of it was. I've tried to look into who that quote goes back to, and there's some debate over who first said it, and I never quite got to the bottom of it. It's been attributed to different people. Putin might be one of them, but I kind of doubt that it's his words.
Well,
I think the line is that those who, yeah, I know.
They're saying he said it, but whether he created it to start with, but he said it in the speech, which would indicate he was not trying to recreate the former glory. He just wants to do what he, something less than that. The border,
yeah,
some kind of border.
If he did say that, I'd be interested in knowing that. But he's certainly said a lot of things in recent years, and they don't really make sense without some analysis of who his target audience is. And I wouldn't argue that he wants to recreate the Soviet Union. I would argue that he actually wants to recreate something like the Russian Empire. There's something really anti-modern in what he says, and he was critical in that speech, I think, of Stalin and Lenin for creating, he says that they created Ukraine, which any historian who knows the history of Ukraine would know that that's not at all true. Ukraine has a very complicated history, kind of divided between East and West with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and going back to the Varangian princes in Kyiv and stuff like that. Putin looks to that period as the beginning of Russia. Anyway, I don't want to get into Russian history, but I think that if Putin's nostalgia looks back to anything, it's to the glory of the Russian Empire and not so much to the Soviet Union, although he thinks that by giving up so many countries and all the Baltic states and several other republics and countries in Eastern Europe that were sort of within the Soviet Cold War kind of fold, a lot was given up then, and he thinks that that was really bad, which is essentially saying that he is the president of a country that still wants to be much larger than it is. And it's already the largest on the planet, stretching from Europe to the Pacific Ocean, with a lot of minorities that don't necessarily want to be part of it, if they had any choice.
Do you think that
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
My memory is during World War II, there was some kind of a way that our Defense Department could communicate with the Russian Defense Department to avoid a nuclear mishap. And I wonder if there's any chance of that now.
I think you mean during the Cold War period, like the red phone or something they used to talk about?
Yes, I'm talking about the red phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I remember some talk when Trump was president about him. They didn't talk about a red phone, but they talked about him having the nuclear button, and there was worry about that. But that's not a phone. I don't know. That's a good question. I certainly have not heard any talk about there being a phone that presumably Biden could get on to call Vladimir and chat with him.
Wayne, you have a question?
Yes, I wonder if you could elaborate on the non-NATO no-fly zone. That sounds like an interesting concept, but I don't know how it would, how we wouldn't be going to war with Russia.
Yeah. Well, let me give you the details about that. Just a sec. I have them.
You can put it in the chat too, if you'd like.
Yeah, I can put it in the chat. I have a link to it.
One other little comment here. The red phone never really existed as a phone. It was a teletype.
Teletype.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
maybe.
I'm sure they have, email. There's lots of ways to communicate. I don't think that's any hindrance nowadays. People can just pick up the phone, but in the old days, what they always called the red phone was actually a teletype, because they probably wanted a nice, clean written record of what was going on.
Yeah, so the idea of the non-NATO no-fly zone, there's I believe a political scientist whose name is Andreas Umland, who has tweeted about this, and I'm just looking at his tweet. So 5 steps: secure a couple of West Ukrainian airports with enough anti-aircraft installations to make them usable. So Lviv and 1 or 2 in Western Ukraine. Present Ukraine several dozen decommissioned Western fighter planes and bring them to those West Ukrainian airports, which they could currently do through Poland, Slovakia, a few other places. Find several dozen Western volunteer Air Force veterans and give them Ukrainian citizenship. Now, Russia's been giving Russian citizenship to people in the DNR and LNR, those 2 self-proclaimed republics in Eastern Ukraine. So there's nothing, wrong with that. Present, let's see, find several. Oh yeah, we've got the Air Force vets to fly them. Bring these new Ukrainian citizens to those airports and have them fly in Ukrainian colors to fly sorties from West Ukrainian airports over Ukrainian state territory. There are no NATO troops involved. No NATO territory is in play. But that would allow for the declaration of a no-fly zone and at least some. I mean, would you have planes shooting each other down? Well, you have that now. Nothing would change except that there'd be a little bit of a kind of something behind the declaration of a no-fly zone that would slow down the Russian advance.
I have a question.
Okay, I understand. Sort of send volunteers to try to do it. I think the trick would be to get competent aircraft that could take on the Russian Air Force without just sacrificing those people in like an hour.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Linda, you have a question?
Yes, please. Yeah, sorry. Okay. I was wondering if this no-fly zone could be under the auspices of the UN.
Yeah, I don't see why it couldn't, except that, there'd be some complications around voting, especially if the UN Security Council is involved, which is chaired currently by Russia. But that's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay, another question I have, it's a strange theory of mine, and I'd like to throw it out there to people. And I've had some personal experience with it too. Like, I heard that Putin has Parkinson's. Is this correct?
I have not heard that.
Yeah, because I don't know. So, like, I've heard somewhere that he has Parkinson's. And if that's the case, I know by my own father that in order to keep the symptoms down, you have to take very high level of levodopa, and other anti-Parkinson's drugs. And some of the side effects is increased paranoia and impulse and poor impulse control. So people, let's say, who've never been impulsive, let's say if they've never gambled in their life or whatever, they suddenly become promiscuous or they start to gamble, they start to be very impulsive. And this war never made sense to me because Putin has always in the past been so calculating and careful about starting these things. And it seems it has a real, this starting of this war has a real element of recklessness in it, considering Putin's, what his character always was before. So I'm wondering if, having all those people sit far away from him and this impulsive, this like impulsiveness, this rashness, it could be because as the you know, Putin is the kind of guy, he doesn't want to show weakness. So if he's taking a lot of anti-Parkinson's drugs, because with anti-Parkinson's drugs, you have to take more and more as time goes on because your body, you know, does something called augmentation. It means you need more and more of the drug for it to be effective. And if
So
that's
it's
the
really a
case-
question of, do we think that he's acting out of character, significantly out of character, or is it just a continuation of what we've seen all along?
Yeah, I mean, we can speculate about medical issues and things like that, but to me, it seems like it's a sort of deepening of a certain part of his character. It's he's gotten very emotionally invested in this case of Ukraine and its relationship to Russia, but he definitely seems to be miscalculating and operating with flawed intelligence.
Yeah.
And, you know, what's the root of that flawed intelligence? I don't know, but I think it's partly this, you know, aging autocrat thing and
And
maybe,
self-defense.
maybe other things. And I think, you know, watching those conversations he has across this mega long table suggests that there's a real paranoia as well.
you know,
Goes beyond COVID.
Yeah, because I heard he's gotten health problems, and there's one thing dictators don't like to show, it's weakness with their health.
Yeah, good point, Linda. Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Judy. Just one thing quickly with respect to a prior question. I did hear some reporting that our Defense Department is in touch with the equivalent of the Russian Defense Department with respect to trying to avoid any mishaps. So setting that aside, I'm curious to know your what your opinion is with respect to Putin's designs in the future, assuming that his military incursion into Ukraine is ultimately successful, and especially with respect to now NATO countries that were part of the former Soviet bloc. If it's true that your theory is correct, that what he's looking for is essentially reestablishing a greater Russian empire, I'm curious as to whether that means further incursion into potentially NATO territory, and if that's true, would it not be better to try to stop him militarily now?
Yeah, so if he were successful, and I'll come back to that, I do think that a lot of countries on the border of Ukraine would feel threatened. The Baltic countries would feel very threatened, and there'd be a real NATO buildup, which would ultimately probably lead to worse things happening. Just that dynamic of build up, with people feeling vulnerable on both sides. There's no way that Putin's not going to feel vulnerable, because this comes back to the first part. I don't think he will be successful in taking over Ukraine. It's just too big a country full of people who don't want Russian control right now. That hasn't always been the case. 10 years ago, people's attitudes to Russia in Ukraine were more mixed and more ambivalent and more divided. And now I think 8 years of war and the kind of disinformation that the Russian state has been spreading has led a lot of Ukrainians to feel that there's no way they want to go back to that. So I don't think that they can actually take over Ukraine and keep it. And they can try a police state and concentration camps and everything else. Even that is not ultimately sustainable in the long run. But if they did, there would be a real feeling of vulnerability, and that would lead ultimately to more, to certainly a Cold War, if not hot wars, somewhere along that border with, Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, Poland, the three Baltic countries, Finland. They're all there, and they don't want it. So that's why I tend to agree with you that this has got to get stopped. it could get stopped of its own accord because they'll fail. But to fail, to clearly fail, I think Ukraine needs support for Russia to fail, because the Russian army is still overpowering potentially.
Yeah, Mimi just mentioned that Visa and MasterCard have announced that they've suspended operations in Russia, so further sanctions. I had a question. Given your expertise in the whole Chernobyl accident and the impact on that and social environmentally, what were your impressions? How concerned should we be about the takeover of the nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine and the bombing of it that we saw over the last few days?
It's pretty concerning. From what we hear, it's safe. There's been no radioactivity leaked or anything like that. 5 of the 6 reactors at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant are currently, what do they call it? They're sort of not operating, offline. One of them is at a lower level. From what I've heard, the staff at both that Zaporizhzhia power plant and the Chernobyl, it's no longer an operational power plant, but it still has a lot of radioactive waste and stuff that has to be monitored and controlled. Staff is working, so to speak, at gunpoint. They're not necessarily following the regular changes in shifts and not necessarily getting the provisions that they need. So there's risk there. Hopefully the Russian military that's now in charge won't do anything really stupid. As for why they were shooting missiles in the direction of the power plant, that to me is the most frightening thing. We don't know. We don't know if it's a mistake. We don't know what was the goal there. But I think, obviously it's one of many things that could potentially go wrong. And there are pipelines and there are other sorts of things that could get exploded by bombs. So it's, we're pretty on edge.
Yeah. Isaiah, you have a question?
Yeah. I was curious if we, as the US, are taking the necessary steps to really support Ukraine throughout all of this. So it's more of a question. So I guess my question is, my actual question is, how do we feel about the development, meaning like Switzerland not being neutral anymore in order to, really take this seriously? Because, a lot of people, a lot of the media is shrugging off, the fact that this is a war. And then they're like shifting around the attention as far as because, when Israel and the Palestinians, that whole tension, the protesters took to the streets of Los Angeles and, we're getting people involved. And I feel like, with this case for Ukraine, a lot of the attention is more on the media, and we're we're doing our best to show support, but are we really? And the Ukrainian president is over there looking like a badass with, lines like, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. So that to me just shows the direness of and severity of the situation. And I think that for someone who grew up with nothing, I was speaking to a Ukrainian friend of mine, for someone who Putin grew up with nothing. He grew up very poor. So since that's the case, it's like, is part of it a sense of entitlement to Russia, or is it really just an overall flex that needs to be put into check so that he understands that, all of, the countries, the neighboring countries that border the Ukraine, as much as they're trying to stay out of it, it's like you're inciting you're being an instigator, you're provoking something purposely. And for us to sit here and be naive enough to say, oh yeah, they're just troops are there at the border and nothing's gonna happen, that to me is like, and then something happens. So so my question is that how do we feel about the development of the Swiss no longer being neutral, which they've been neutral for some time, and that now being a fact, it's predominant. So someone who does not endorse or side with war whatsoever is now coming out of a neutral space in order to say, hey, we're seizing funds now. This is now starting to become an economic, it's becoming like a monopoly, like who's doing what, who's securing what, who has what. And I don't want to make a move until I know if it's in my best interest, and that sort of thing. And I feel like that's that.
I'm hearing what you're saying is that you have these traditional neutral parties who have essentially stepped off the curve and taken a stand, and our other countries stepping off the curve and taking a stand to the extent that is required in order to keep this thing from really taking over the world.
Great question. I think, there's a real sense of urgency in Europe that we don't necessarily feel as much of, which is why I think some of those traditionally neutral countries are stepping up, which is why Germany has surprised people by kind of stepping up much more than you would have thought. They have a lot to lose. Germany relies on Russia's natural gas, and now they have to think of alternatives, and yet they feel it's important enough for them to take a strong position. I recognize the delicacy of the issue for President Biden. He doesn't want to take this country into a war, certainly not into a world war, certainly not with a nuclear superpower. At the same time, he wants to show support, and a lot of Americans seem to be on board now. So the question is, how much support, what form? And I think it's sort of a subtle game that has to be played. But I do think that Ukrainians are asking for more support. They need certain kinds of, ground-to-air missiles, javelins, and things like that, if they are going to continue holding out. And they have held out incredibly well, but Russians have used cluster bombs and have been, bombing apartment buildings in major cities. And if that ramps up on the Russian side, then it will have been too little too late. So, I would advocate that we should be providing more, just do it in a smart way. And I think I'll leave it at that. But
okay. John, you have a question?
Just a couple of questions. One was, I was surprised when you mentioned that there were 3 high-level people in the Ukrainian government that were Jewish, and I just looked on the internet and said that of the 44 million people in Ukraine, only 300,000 were Jewish. So I was wondering if you had any, how did that happen? And the other thing has to do with numbers. I understand that Putin's put about 200,000 troops on the border, 3/4 of which have done the invasion, but he has 2 million service people total. So he's got a lot of reserve. He's not, so it looks, so those 2 things about numbers, just how did the Jewish thing happen? Was that just happenstance, or was that a plan?
No, it's happenstance. When Zelensky got voted, Zelensky is a comedian he studied law, I believe, but then he eventually became a comedian and actor who played the role of the president, a kind of populist president, and eventually he decided that, hey, I'm going to run for this, and he got elected overwhelmingly because a lot of Ukrainians were tired of the so-called oligarchs. The last president, Poroshenko, was an oligarch. He made his money on a candy factory But he was considered to be on the right side of things by much of the country. So he won pretty strongly, 56% or something of the vote when he became elected president, which was the first presidential election after the Maidan Revolution. Zelensky got elected. There's no plan to that. He did have a connection to one oligarch, Kolomoisky, who's a Jewish Ukrainian, who had been in trouble with the law. And that's sort of a controversial connection. It's not clear to me if he still is or not, but it's kind of, it's not neither here nor there. The prime minister at the time that Zelensky was elected was, I'm blanking on his name.
Poroshenko.
No, the prime minister was had been the mayor of Vinnytsia, which is a central Ukrainian city, before becoming prime minister. So I guess, in a sense, it shows that to most Ukrainians who either vote these people in or the prime minister was appointed by the previous president, Poroshenko, to most Ukrainians, it doesn't matter what your ethnic background is, it matters what your positions are. And I think that the concept of civic nationalism has become much stronger as opposed to, say, ethnic nationalism, which is what right-wing nationalists tend to want to see, a kind of ethnicity being some sort of defining factor. I would say that Zelensky's example is just an example that it doesn't matter who you are, it matters what you do. And he's trying to show that right now. And maybe it's helped rally the support of Ukrainians all around the country. He was a Russian speaker until, people in certain parts of Ukraine grow up speaking Russian, in other parts of Ukraine grow up speaking Ukrainian, but they essentially know both because you hear both in the media and nowadays in the education system. In the Soviet Union, Ukrainian was demoted and Russian was sort of privileged. And in the Russian Empire, Ukrainian was banned in official, in literature at least, in the print media. But now it doesn't matter, but the fact that Zelensky comes from the south, comes from a southern, mainly Russian-speaking city, I think helps to rally all Ukrainians on board to the current government, the current situation of Ukrainians.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I think those are all the questions that we had.
One
There
more.
one more, okay. Go
Okay,
ahead.
if there's, all right.
Neil.
The YouTube has some information on Putin's inner circle. And there's some discussion, I guess nobody's quite sure which of his inner circle has his ear most often and most profoundly. And I wonder if if you have an insight into which one he's listening to the most. You wonder, given the picture of him at one end of a 20-foot long table and the other guys down at the other end, presumably quaking, is there, for instance, Alexander Dugin is a philosopher and gives some of the theoretical foundation to Putin's vision?
I think that Dugin, there's some history between them, and clearly Putin has read Dugin. For those who don't know Dugin, he's kind of he doesn't call himself that, but I would certainly call him a fascist philosopher who has this vision of geopolitics as a clash of civilizations, with Russia sort of playing the leading role to create a Eurasian, essentially, empire that would take on the West and defeat liberalism and defeat democracy and all of that. To what extent has Putin been influenced by him? I think on some level, not just by him, but there are, a lot of other philosophers, if we call them that, in Russia, who say something along those lines. I think Putin's come to his own conclusions and made his own decisions. I don't know who he's listening to right now. I haven't seen anything about Dugin and Putin being in contact recently, but who knows?
Right. I think was that the last question?
No, I've got a question.
I don't know, Adrian, how much time you have, but
I'm okay. I can.
you're okay? Okay.
Could
All
the
right.
oligarchs carry out a palace revolution against Putin?
A palace. Well, there's a long history of palace coups in Russia, going back to the Russian Empire. So it's possible, but I suspect that Putin, being as the kind of guy that he is, he's tried to patch up any possible leaks in his own submarine that he lives in. So it would probably be very difficult, but I think that may be on the books. There may be people thinking of that. I don't know.
Lindsey Graham.
Yeah. Isaiah, you've got your hand up?
Yeah, I guess it seemed like we were nearing like the end of it. So I wanted to just kind of, throw out there and ask how everyone feels about the, I guess it would be more like esoterica. It'd be considered that. It's like floating rumors of like Putin making moves for, to kind of incite, war. In like the fact that it's Ukraine is convenient, and he's making that the case, but then trying to kind of inadvertently get others involved. And if I guess there is this blog that I was reading saying like the whole prophecy, doomsday sort of thing of China and Russia becoming the superpower, and then really coming for the U.S. and Biden just being the guy old enough to I'm personally I thought Trump was a guy, he had a comedic sense, that no one could, he had this sense of publicity in the media that no one can take him really seriously as a president, even though that was his position, so I feel like Ukrainian president did it in a different way. It's just like, hey, I played a non-serious role, and and he made something of it, and gained the support of the people by not taking himself so seriously, versus we had a president who took himself far too seriously, and personally with Biden, I just feel like he's frail. I don't feel the last 4 years have really, I don't feel as an American that I've been, I've really had a president, I just feel like I've been operating under my own, fundamental means of being an American, and everything else is the, political. So I guess my question was, how for anyone who may or may not be religious, how do we feel about, just like whispers in the wind of, this being a little bit more serious than it actually is?
Well, I have two comments that come to mind. They're not directly answering your question. One is that, the whole China thing, I didn't really mention that, but I do think that Xi Jinping has been watching to see how this plays out, and it's not playing out so well for Putin. And that's a good thing for the Taiwanese, for instance. It may mean that China's going to be more cautious, might try to mediate rather than back Putinist Russia right now. And for the world, that could be a good thing. As far as any religious sort of things, I don't want to speculate on any of that, but knowing that I'm speaking to an audience of, many of you identify, as I understand it, as secular humanists, I have, one of the thoughts I've had about this invasion is that, unlike many where religion plays the role of exacerbating conflicts because people are on different teams, so to speak. In this case, Russians and Ukrainians, many of them are Orthodox Christians. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church is different from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and that complicates things. But I could see that if a bunch of babushkas were standing carrying icons of Mother Mary to defend their town from incoming Russian soldiers, those Russian soldiers could stop and think twice, because they would see their own grandmothers in front of them. And in this case, therefore, religion can play a kind of potentially mediating role on the ground. It's not going to do that politically in any way, but on the ground it could. And that doesn't answer your question, Isaiah, but I think I thought I'd throw it out there.
A good thought. Suzette, let's take your question as the last one.
Okay, I don't know that it's really a question, but I would like you to comment maybe. There seems to be a lot of similarities between Trump and his rhetoric about calling anybody who opposed him as liars, it's fake, and and what Putin is doing. It seems like he's listening to Trump, if anybody.
Or the other way around. I think Trump actually learned that technique from watching, or at least secondhand getting a sense of how Russian media and how Putin has acted. The whole fake news thing, I mean, that's a global phenomenon, and it's been used by autocrats to discredit real news and real media, and to discredit and obscure reality so that people don't know what's what. Yeah. And that's been very much part of Russian informational strategy around the world. Not that it's exclusive to them. We have people here who've been doing it, and the CIA has done things, and we know all that. But right now, media warfare is an active element in the world. And I think one of the differences between the Ukrainian side and the Russian side here is that some of the Ukrainian cyber hackers are doing open source stuff. They're getting people around the world to hack into Russian state websites, whereas the Russian cyber hackers, they're there too, but they're not going to open their things up to open source activism, because they know that the people who believe in that are going to tend to be on the side of, in this case, the ones fighting for democracy and for their own lives, as opposed to the ones attacking a foreign country.
Great.
So, okay. I know that we're trying to close things off, and I see that Linda's hand is up and that she had a comment about my backdrop. So I'm just going to say briefly that, yes, the blue on top and yellow on the bottom is the color of the Ukrainian flag, and the sunflowers are the national flower of Ukraine. But also, if you haven't seen the video of the elderly woman bringing sunflower seeds to some Russian soldiers, look it up. It's great. She's telling them, why are you here? Go home, just drop some of these sunflower seeds so that something good grows out of your dead bodies. And it's a moving video, and there are a lot of interesting videos out there from the nonviolent civil resistance that you see on the streets in towns and villages all over Ukraine right now. So I am kind of referring to that with my sunflower backdrop.
Thank you. I want to give Alona the last word. So Alona is the one who connected us together and made it possible for you to give us this talk today. So Alona, you have any comments for us?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to give a little blurb from a personal perspective, because to me, it's a personal matter. I have family in Ukraine. My parents are in Ukraine. And it's been very difficult, 10 days, just sort of waking up to feeling, gosh, I have to check my phone and call my family and make sure they're alive and safe. And I wanted to thank Adrian and Judy and everyone who was involved in putting this together in such a short span of time, because it makes a huge difference. I think that talking about things that is a demonstration of active resistance, and you never know what comes out of a little gathering, a little talk, because and there's this great there's this great phrase, which is in the East Gallery on the remainders of the Berlin Wall, that says that many small people in many small places make small things, but they change the face of the world. So far, I was surprised and touched how many people have showed a lot of interest and support, and that I was swamped with messages and emails with people asking how to help, and people reaching out from all over, requests coming from Ukraine, going around to Canada, going back to Europe, and then coming back to Ukraine. And then people just make things happen. I see lots of volunteering groups who unite and try to provide support to Ukraine. There are lots of groups in the Bay Area. There are lots of groups in Southern California. And they have volunteers that consist, their group of volunteers consists of people that have very, very little connection to Ukraine, which is absolutely heartwarming to me that they are, there's so much care for the cause.
Great,
That's how I
thank you.
thank everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Alona. So thanks, Alona. Thanks, Adrian, for everyone who participated today. And I think I'll end it there. So we would be interested in seeing if you would send your charts to me, then I'll post those links you had about places that people can go to help and donate, and post that on our website and in the YouTube video. All right, so.
Okay, thank you, Judy, and thank you, Alona, for arranging this. And I hope your family is hanging in Ukraine. And thank you, everyone.
All right. All righty, goodbye.